Luis, Stolton, Javier Espinoza. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. It's our tradition, and I'm very grateful for maintaining this tradition. For the third year in a row, we meet. I have an honor to invite the top tier competition law experts in the area of journalism, broader public media, and public communication to reflect in an honest, easygoing way on the main trends and interpret the development in competition in the European competition law. I wanted to start with inviting each of you to highlight three or to articulate three main developments over in the late 24, beginning of 24, first half of the 25. But I wanted first of all to start with the most important news, namely, Javier, you have changed affiliation. Maybe you can tell us in half a minute, where are you now?
Yes, thank you for the giving me the floor first. What an honor, and good to see you all. I did move from the Financial Times to the Capital Forum to be the editor bureau chief here in Brussels and in London as well. And the bigger context is that the Brussels media landscape is somewhat changing. All eyes are on Brussels. The interest of what the Commission is doing, it's increasing, and we are working on building a newsroom with new people. We have Joanna Sopinska joining us tomorrow to do trade. We're hiring more people to do competition. So just is an indication that the interest in the European policy competition story is growing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So perhaps, Luis, we can start with you. 24-25 academic year, key developments.
I think there's only been one key development of the past 12 months, really, and that has been the influence of Donald Trump on policymaking around the world. Everything is part of a trade deal. Everything is a negotiation. The rule book, which the European Union has set about building over the last 5-10 years, predominantly in digital, which is kind of what's the daily bread of Sam and Javier and me, but also more broadly in things like labor standards and environmental standards. Europe's created this massive rule book, and now it's almost impossible to enforce it. It's also almost impossible to use any rule which either applies extraterritorially or applies to foreign companies in Europe, which is pretty much every rule which the European Union has developed. And now any move is perceived as a attack, for want of a better word, on foreign companies. And it is treated and seen as such by the White House. And that has really put a huge question mark over the ability of Brussels to do what Brussels has always done, which is write rules and enforce them. I think that's the central narrative that has dominated all of our lives for the last 12 months.
Thank you, Samuel.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And listen, this goes to the very sort of heart of the identity of the European Commission. And its raison d'etre for many years has been to regulate. And there has been, almost a blank slate in terms of who it chooses to target, when, where, and how robustly particular companies are pursued. Of course, Donald Trump has totally changed the game. And it's not necessarily whether or not his tariff threats ever manifest into reality, but it's the spectre of Trump that haunts over Brussels policymaking at the moment. So it's actually the perceived threat of what he would or would not do in response to a European Commission decision, be it on a 102 case or under the DMA, that is hamstringing regulators' ability to go after big tech as it had done before. Now, that's not saying, they've been given a totally free pass. There have been the first DMA fines earlier this year. You had 500 million for Apple and 200 million for Meta as part of those first tranche of fines. And of course, more recently, you had the Google ad tech fine that was nearing 3 billion euros. So enforcement continues, but there is perhaps a strategy to the enforcement this time round. There's a way the Commission's going about communicating these decisions. You know, gone are the days of the theatrical press conferences where Vestager would stand on stage and preach to the world's press about fairness and contestability in digital markets. Now we're at a situation where we have press releases handed to us, you know, in some occasions, last thing at the end of the day, with no press conference. And, you know, very, very little in terms of extra access given to the high-level officials behind these decisions. And clearly that's a strategy that has come down from the 13th floor. And it's a desire to appease Trump, or at least to lessen any sort of kickback from the White House, which I see, my personal view on that is it's rather a fruitless exercise, because Trump will intervene when he wants to intervene. Doesn't matter how you communicate about it. But that I do agree with Lewis there on Trump being the biggest factor that has changed the course of things. But enforcement continues, but in a different way.
And to add and not just repeat what my colleague said, I also think that it's interesting how personalities actually influence the regulation. Obviously, you have the law, and the law has to be implemented in the way that it has to. But the Trump 2.0 coincided almost at the same time with the change in the dynamics of the European Commission, where we had a commission that was filled at least with a handful of very strong challengers to the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And some argue that this commission is filled more with yes men and women, with, you know, very little in the way of personality or opposition to the president, which has led to a Stalin-like regime where one person, actually two, Ursula von der Leyen and Bjorn Seiber, who's like the head of cab of the president, are essentially changing the dynamics of the way that competition enforcement is done. So, for example, right now we have a live case, which is the maker of Mars bars buying the maker of Pringles, where some have said there's not many kind of clear competition issue in the way of overlapping of horizontal, vertical overlaps in the way that we talk about potentially anti-competitive deals. This has, as we reported late Sunday, has had the recommendation of DG Comp to be clear unconditionally, but it's gone into the vortex of the machine of the president and other higher up officials in the way as I just come from a lunch with somebody who was in the previous administration. This would not have been the case in Vestager 1 or 2. The process was one very streamlined, and it was one where the president or the college would just really rubber stamp these decisions because the competition commissioner had a lot of power and experience. I feel that there are some cracks in this dynamic. Lewis knows well because MLex had the scoop of, you know, a fine against Google that was going to come, and then it didn't, and then it came, but with a subdued sort of music. You know, the mood music has changed. And just to finish on this idea of the mood music, because I also look at the UK increasingly more now. I was there in London talking to advisors on these deals, and essentially what they tell me is that it's open season, that we are in a deregulatory environment where some lawyers are even advising, you know, how can we structure a deal so that it doesn't meet the thresholds and it can fly under the radar of the authorities. So I think that, yeah, it's kind of like de-escalation deregulation, which is very interesting because we come from years of hipster antitrust where it was highly interventionist, hardcore enforcement. So it's just interesting to note the shift.
Let us pause on this. Is an explanation for this is exclusively a kind of response to pacify the emotional reaction from the US, and as Sam has noted, whatever you do, there is always 1,001 way to problematize the European Union regulatory system if there is such a desire, or is it is it just a kind of decoration, or it is also a change of the very attitude to this enthusiasm to shape competition in digital markets, or even digital markets themselves, which we witnessed over the last few years? Yes.
Look, I think a lot of what my colleague said is bang on the money, but regulating these markets has always been tricky. There's always been companies trying to avoid regulation. There's always been political realities. But what's happened is all this sensitivity has been kept very successfully in the shadows. Yeah, companies have back-channeled messages. Politicians have worked out their differences in the corridors. What we've seen in the last couple of months is this breaking out into the open very, very explosively. It's happened with the way decisions are taken, it's happened with international relations, and it's happened with the way companies behave towards the regulator. I can't remember a time when a company has stood up and explicitly asked for a piece of legislation to be withdrawn. So obviously and clearly, while facing many regulatory investigations under that piece of legislation, that's Apple with the DMA. I can't remember a time where decisions have been subject to dissent hours before they're taken. I can't remember a time where a leader of another country has called for pieces of legislation which aren't even known to most people in Brussels to be withdrawn. I mean, it's remarkable that something like the Digital Services Act, which is, we know about it, but it's pretty arcane stuff, is on the Twitter feed or truth feed of a president. So I don't think there's sort of much new in the fact that all these things create tensions, and people are trying to, companies are trying to, like Javier says, avoid, thresholds to be for notification. That's always been the case. I think what happens now is people are so blatantly doing this in public, and so sort of flagrantly taking on the regulator and taking on the seeking to escalate some of these political tensions to benefit from them. There's a huge debate in the US about that, about how a merger which was HP Juniper was in court and managed to get out of court rather quickly through lobbying. And I think we're just seeing the surfacing of some of these things, which have always been there bubbling away. And as my colleagues have said, been navigated in, sort of much more quietly in the past without exploding into the public. But now it's all fair game and it's all very, very public.
Thank you, Lewis. Sam?
Yeah, just following up from that. I mean, we're seeing the geopoliticization of antitrust more explicitly than we've ever done before. It has always been there. Yes, that's correct. But the methods of which, different stakeholders, different parties attempt to jockey against or for certain positions are now out in the open. It seems to be paying dividends. In terms of, some of the decisions that we've seen this year. The DMA fines were relatively small. Of course, the Commission justified those fines on a technical basis, but you could imagine perhaps in a different era, they would have been, the first landmark fines would have perhaps been beefed up even more. The Google Ad Tech decision didn't include a formal breakup order, and there are transatlantic reasons for that as well. Obviously, the DOJ's case ongoing in the United States, the remedy trials are happening as we speak. So a lot of these things, and I totally agree with what Lewis says there, that previously no one in the public domain had an insight to, or if you did, you really had to be a fly on the wall in some of these discussions and debates. They are now being fought out in the public arena. And that certainly, at the moment, you could estimate seems to be to the advantage of the White House and what the interests that Donald Trump is serving himself. The commission at the moment largely seems to be adopting a reactive position on a lot of these things, because it's just not perhaps in their DNA to be so active on these communications. But it seems like we've used the word catch up in this discussion already a couple of times. It seems like the commission is always playing catch up with really the message emanating from DC or whatever Trump decides to post on a particular late night evening. And I think that's a really difficult question for the commission to contend with. How does it perhaps be less reactive in its communication strategy and more on the front foot? It's not an easy question to answer, and it does come with inherent geopolitical risks. But you know, it's a question that nonetheless they should be thinking about more and more if they're to tamper this looming threat from across the other side of the Atlantic.
And they should be thinking about it more and more, because the vibe that I'm picking up from senior American officials in Europe is that it's not over yet, that they will continue the escalation, as Lewis was saying, against these digital tech rules, which are, of course, extremely intertwined and directly related to antitrust enforcement of big tech companies. And I think we haven't seen the whole sort of reaction of the US yet. I do think, though, and I think, you know, I say this as somebody who's like a fan of the EU, let's say, but I think that the EU has been weak, chaotic, dispersed, not really focused. And I think that's really great for an American administration who just basically has like one person reacting in a very efficient, fast way. So I think really, yeah, it's a shame that the EU has been like that, though I like to use the metaphor of the elephant. And we have seen how the European Commission can actively, very powerfully move when there are crises like COVID or the energy crisis. And maybe we are not realizing it yet, but this elephant is moving in the direction of even stronger action. I would like to think or hope that could be the case.
Thank you
Can I
very
just
much
jump
for
in,
this.
Olex, on that point? Because there's some really, it made me sort of think, what is the end game here? You know, in this transatlantic spat, and inevitably this will go on for a long, long time, because something has got to give, really. Is the end game that the EU starts to dilute the sovereignty of its own legal regime in favor of keeping Trump happy? Is it possible to keep Trump happy with an individual who has that much of a sort of symphony of volatile emotions? I think it's actually impossible to keep him on the good side ad infinitum. So it is a question of political strategy, a lot of this. It's not easy. And the EU has to ask itself what values that it holds dearest to its heart. Because if this is about the rule of law and the sovereignty of EU law, then it shouldn't matter what threats necessarily emerge from the White House. Of course, practically, there are certain threats that the Commission needs to heed to, be it tariffs or perhaps even more worryingly, the war in Ukraine. But where's the end game for this? And I'd be keen on hearing what my esteemed colleagues have to say about this, because it's we could be stuck in this sort of Gordian knot type situation for quite a few years.
Where is the end game? Let me add a little bit to this question, connected with the one on the DMA more specifically. The DMA itself has been designed not as a kind of, not necessarily as a neutral mechanism. It has been, it enables you to select the gatekeepers and to put on them very heavy burden of obligations, compliance with which can be, you know, subject to interpretation. And in the more proactive modality, you can continue with interpreting non-compliance more and more proactively. So I wanted to ask you, do you think such proactive enforcement of proto-competition rules in digital markets still is there any, not only room, but is there any desire? Do we still have an appetite of the European Commission to change the way how competition functions in digital markets, or it's only, or is it somehow in a less visible mode, in more hibernated mode, where we have to wait a little bit until these emotions will be softer, and then we can restart? Or it has completely gone and we somehow we just continue doing DMA because it's in our rule book and we just have to do it? Do you still have this ambition to change the digital markets themselves?
Look, I think you have to give the Commission credit on what has changed already, and it doesn't change necessarily in the spotlight. Yeah, we're all looking at non-compliance because it's a story. Yeah, it's conflict, it's money, it's almost an ideological fight about the future of digital services. But the Commission will stand up and say there are reams of digital products and services which have changed. And they're changing quietly, and they're changing in the shadows. There are browser choice screens, there are API logins, there are alternative app stores, there are subscriptions which have gone down, there are the removal of clauses we never even knew were there. So how can we, how can we necessarily get a good news story out of that would be the challenge for the Commission. And you have to give them credit. This stuff is happening. It's happening outside of official procedures, which we usually write about. There's nothing launched, there's nothing started, there's no statement of objections or preliminary findings sent. These are things changing in, horrible phrase, but regulatory dialogue. And I think they deserve credit on that. Obviously, the attention goes to these bigger fights, and they are the ones which go to the center of business models. People, surprise, people give up stuff which doesn't matter too much for them. Small little matter. I'm being flippant, but giving someone a little bit of extra browser choice could be no big deal compared to absolutely existential question about how you monetize your app store, or how you gather data across your services of the users across your services. So I think the really tricky question is like, how much, your question is, how much do we want to make the DMA, or how much do they want to make the DMA actually work? And it comes down to this one word in the law, which is effective compliance. What does effective mean? The companies think they've effectively complied because there's the letter of the law. The law says, I do this and I've done this. And obviously for the Commission, they see the word as effective compliance as effectively changing the market. It is bringing an effect on the market to the people who want it. And it leaves you with this sort of difficult question about what is it that you want? Do you want me to comply with the letter of the law? And I'm going to do that. It might not lead to changes on the market, but that might not be because of me. It might be because the law's not very good. It might be because the consumers don't like it. It might be because people never wanted this choice or this new product in the first place. And so a lot of this war crystallizes down to the word effective. And you'll hear these gatekeepers say, I'm in the business of complying. I'm not in the business of guaranteeing outcomes. The outcomes is the responsibility of the legislator and the responsibility of the regulator. That's what you designed it for, these particular outcomes. But it's not my job to make sure we get 6% more users doing this next week, and 7 the week after, and 8% the week after. And so I think, we need to give the Commission and the regulators credit for all the stuff that happens outside of the headlines, and there is plenty of it. But then it all boils down to this kind of effective word, and quite understandably, some of the large companies are saying, I'm effectively complying. It might not be the compliance that you want, and if it's not, take me to court. And I challenge you to take me to court at political times like these.
Samuel.
One observation as well is that obviously the European Commission and the enforcement of the law is quite complex, in that you have, of course, people who are on the day-to-day implementation and enforcement of these rules quite adamant or very aggressive about these rules being implemented to the max. And then, of course, you have what we have been discussing, I think, and it's the flavor of the current situation, the political powers that have to think about how the optics, how is this perceived, to please this person or not. And so I guess that the reality is more complex in that, of course, there are those that are, implementing sort of the dogma, let's say, of the rules, and those who are, thinking more about the geopolitics or the optics.
Thank you very much, Samuel.
What was the question again? Sorry, I'm sort of.
The question was, what's the you started with the end game,
Yes.
and I wanted to add it to complement it with a question about the end game of the DMA, not necessarily in terms of the more the better and the quicker the better, but I wonder if there is a kind of long-term strategy in the commission where some behind secret doors where the true meter of what is fair and what is contestable means, and what it is in the best interest of European Union, which shape of the markets would be in the best interest of the EU.
Yes, well, that sort of leitmotif, what is fair and contestable, those terms are in themselves rather contestable. I mean, particularly for economists who disagree the world over what is fair and contestable. Going back to this endgame question, I suppose we have to reflect on what will the digital economy look like at the point at which the DMA is being enforced as the Commission had originally envisioned it. Now, perhaps that's now. And you could make the claim that, okay, well, if it's now, not a great deal has changed. There are things going on behind closed doors. There are tweaks here and there. But I mean, if we all reflect on our own online experience nowadays, there hasn't been this massive overhaul of the types of technologies we've been using or our access to those technologies, how those technologies interoperate with one another. So I suppose the question we're asking ourselves is, what will the internet look like after the DMA is enforced as it was originally intended to do? And we simply don't know when that point, if at all, will ever come. And it's largely down to the political vision of the enforcement of these types of tools. And you could argue that the vision of Vestager was different from the vision of Ribera. And the vision of Ribera now could be different from the vision of Ribera in 2 years' time. So these things are rather fluid. They're moving month by month. The sort of meta-narrative of it all is, as we stand here today, not a great deal has changed in terms of our online experience. There's been a hell of a lot of lobbying against the DMA, and there have been engineering teams tasked to make a number of different changes. But clearly there is a critical mass of resistance against the DMA to go perhaps as far as the Commission would want, or not necessarily even the Commission. Smaller competitors and rivals would want them to go. So I think the main struggle at the moment is this difference of ideas and difference of opinions and visions as to what the DMA actually is, what it can achieve and what it can't achieve. And we're still trying to work through those questions now.
Great. I'm mindful that we only have 8 minutes left. So on this moment, I wanted to propose to revise our tradition and maybe to meet more often than once a year, because it looks that we just started talking and you are really open to conversation. So thank you very much. It's really exciting. It would be the shortest, probably one of the most dense episodes. Let me very quickly ask you again with you, Lewis. It looks that if you look at the UK and the recent deal, which is a technology prosperity deal, it looks that it may well be that we have a very powerful argument that we invite big tech companies into UK and EU. They invest billions into their AI infrastructure, And Europe, broader Europe, is converting itself into a kind of farm club. You are part of the chain. You are not anymore just being exploited, or not exploited, how to say. You are not only the market where we sell products, you're also part of the production chain. And yet still you are not in the Champions League. You are a farm club, a decent, solid farm club. You can benefit from it. There are many opportunities for small and medium companies, etc. Is it the maximum you can expect at this period, or we still have this broader ambition to play in the top tournaments?
I think the UK has been very clear, both politically, or from the political classes and from the regulatory classes, that these are different times now. These are times about pro-growth. Obviously, the last regime would have said they were pro-growth as well, but pro a different kind of growth this time. Huge deals announced along when Donald Trump came to the UK for his state visit. Regulators who were reviewing the fewest mergers that they've perhaps ever reviewed. A entire regime built like the DMA, which is now got a question mark on how do we, what's the next interpretation of this regime? Because the regime was built at a time, like Sam said at the beginning, where things looked very, very different. So how do you do it now? I know I speak to a lot of the big tech companies and they actually like working with the UK regulator. They think the UK regulator understands their business well and they get good conversations and decent outcomes, but it's still very, very early days for that. I think what's interesting is the UK, you know, it's been diverging and it feels such a different place now to regulatory and commercial business sphere than Europe. And it's going to be an interesting test case. It's going to, you know, at the same time, it is struggling economically, huge, you know, injections into Jaguar Land Rover in the last few days because of a cyber attack. You know, the country is searching for its soul. I think that does boil down to the rather arcane parts of regulation that we look at. But it goes back to the central point that I made at the beginning, which is all of these jurisdictions created massive legal instruments over the last 10 years. Now the politics, in Javier's words, the mood music's change. What do you do with that now? You've either, you know, you can't lay down the weapons entirely. You've got to use them. I think the UK would like to see that they can do different things with their tools. Same for the Germans. The Germans invented, you know, 19A that we all know about. They're also trying to show that this is not just the DMA light or DMA alternative. It can do good things and better things and different things than the DMA regime. And the more the DMA comes under pressure, as Sam was saying, the more these other regimes perhaps find space to create their own outcomes, which might be more business friendly, might be swifter, might be better for complainants, might be better for markets, more nimble as regards to changing technologies like AI. So I think the UK is an interesting test case. Well, I think it's got some serious existential problems at the same time.
Thank you, Lewis. Javier.
I think just a broader point, maybe, so that we don't get just bogged down on the regulation and implementing DMA or this rule and the other. I think that we need to keep in mind that these rules may as well enable the conditions for the markets to thrive. But I think that really there have been some vocal voices in recent months or years. We should focus on changing the mindset. You know, every couple of years I go to Silicon Valley. Sometimes I interact with the entrepreneurs there. And really, you know, they have this mentality of move fast and break things. And this is something that we hugely miss in this continent, to take risks and do things.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I suppose the broader point on the success of regulation and how Europe is able to build up its own competitiveness, of course, is front and center of the policy agenda at the moment. The Commission has to ask itself some very, very deep existential questions about what it wants to achieve. Clearly, regulating some of the world's largest American tech companies is a much harder task now than it was 5 years ago, and that it's been over the past decade, because we're having all of these disputes debated in the public arena. So how do you look to a Europe that is able to go toe-to-toe with industrial or tech champions emanating from the United States or China. How do you do that? Where's the capital going to come from? Is it just a case of regulating other companies, or are you able actually to develop some sort of a grand industrial policy program that you can follow in concrete steps? And it has to be, you know, 25, 30, 40-year plan in order to get Europe to that level. And I think that's a question of identity. And I say that because, you know, particularly the European Commission has been embedded in a culture of regulation for many, many years. It's been the way that technocrats and bureaucrats have approached their job. And it is about, yes, the culture of the institution itself. So it's a real paradigm shift, actually. I think we're on the cusp of here. And who will lead that charge? We've been living in a sort of legal, political, and policy orbit since the new von der Leyen mandate, still of this incessant circulation of compasses, white papers, communications being rolled out time and time again. The Draghi report that was celebrated its year anniversary recently came up again with the same messages. You know, we're falling behind in terms of our global competitiveness. We need a plan, we need a strategy, and we need a way to work through it. It's missing at the moment, and it's been missing in tech for many, many years. Is it too late? Some may say so, some may say that, you know, there's still time in particular emerging technologies. But these are questions that, as I say, go to the heart of the Commission's identity, like we spoke about at the beginning. You need some sort of a grand meta-narrative to drive these decisions, because at the moment it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you. And at this point, we have to pause. But for obviously, I hope it will not take us a year to reconvene again. But 20 seconds each. Communication, key message to students.
My key message to students, particularly students of law and regulation, is this is your time. Never before have we seen such a clash between politics and laws and the enforcement of laws that you are finding yourself, you know, not in some dusty library in a forgotten part of research. Stuff is alive, it is living, and it's in the battle for its life. And therefore, you know, embrace the moment.
Javier.
You can be part of a new movement called the Mega Movement, Make Europe Great Again.
So.
Sorry, that made me chuckle. Hashtag. Students, knock down doors. And I'm speaking particularly to students of journalism here, to add a different flavour. In order to get into our business, you have to jockey hard, you have to graft hard, and you have to have your name on the desk of editors as often as you can do. It's a difficult business to break into, particularly for students from disadvantaged backgrounds as well. Knock down doors, get on the phone, get your foot into some of these newsrooms. And those are really, really good skills that actually lend itself to the practice and the craft of journalism in the future, because you will be forever knocking down doors and phoning up people who don't necessarily want to talk to you, and trying to run around for those market-moving scoops. So knock down doors, get your name out there, and pursue these issues with, and apologies for my, oh, actually, this is being recorded, isn't it? Okay. Did you see the WhatsApp? Okay, that's good. Talking of scoops, I've had a couple that have just come in now. So
can you share? Can you share with the cast?
Well, my heart skipped a beat a moment there, and this is actually a good example of how fast these things can come in. A WhatsApp message can suddenly send the market into turmoil. It won't in this instance, but things change within a heartbeat. So you need to be able to drop things at breakneck speed and jump on stories. So keep knocking down those doors to all the students out there in the journalism world, and also drop me a line as well if you're interested in getting into this world. Like Javier said at the beginning, it is a very competitive beat at the moment. Drop me a line. I'm happy to provide any informal guidance. at any time. The more competition we have, the better. So best of luck to all students out there, and yeah, keep going.
Absolutely. Lewis Crofts, Javier Espinoza, Samuel Stolton, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.